join us. All right. Hello, everyone. Welcome to Cows, Science, and the Law. I'm your moderator, Jamie McLaughlin. This webinar is the second in a series of American Bar Association ILS International Animal Law Committee webinars focusing on science and animal law. Today's program is a joint production of the ABA ILS International Animal Law Committee and George Washington University Law School Animal Law Program. I'd like to thank Kathy Hessler, Joan Schaffner, and Yingzi Dai at GW Law Animal Law for collaborating on this project. Additional programs are available through the GW Animal Law and Science Project. Those webinars can be found on the GW Law Animal Law YouTube channel, and Yingzi Dai will add a link to that playlist in our chat. Today's webinar will be recorded and posted to the GW Law Animal Law Program YouTube channel. No CLE is available for today's program. Now, please allow me to welcome our panelists. Gregory Berns, MD, PhD, is the Distinguished Professor of Neuroeconomics in the Psychology Department at Emory University, where he directs the Facility for Education and Research in Neuroscience. Trained as a biomedical engineer, he was also a practicing psychiatrist in the Department of Psychiatry at Emory University and was one of the founding members of the field of neuroeconomics, using fMRI to study mechanisms of decision-making in humans. In 2011, he launched an effort to train dogs to cooperatively participate in fMRI studies, resulting in the first demonstration of its feasibility. Since then, he has trained and scanned 100 dogs on a variety of cognitive paradigms. Dr. Berns is the author of 6 books, including the New York Times best-selling How Dogs Love Us, A Neuroscientist and His Adopted Dog Decode the Canine Brain, Iconoclast, What Neuroscience Reveals About How to Think Differently, which was named one of the best business books of 2008 by Fast Company, The Self-Delusion, Satisfaction, and What It's Like to Be a Dog and Other Adventures in Animal Neuroscience, which was named by Smithsonian as a top 10 science book of 2017 and by Bark as one of the top 5 dog books of 2017. His latest book is Cow Puppy, An Unexpected Friendship and a Scientist's Journey into the Secret World of Cows. Dr. Berns lives on a farm south of Atlanta with his wife, some chickens, too many dogs, no, that's not possible, and some very special cows. Our second speaker today is Laura Fox. Laura is a research scholar at the Yale Law School and a litigation fellow at Yale's Law, Environment, and Animals program, focusing on the climate, environmental, and social impacts of industrial animal agriculture. Previously, Laura was a visiting professor and an inaugural director of the Farmed Animal Advocacy Clinic at Vermont Law and Graduate School. She also served as a senior staff attorney at the Humane Society of the United States and a visiting fellow at Harvard Law School's Animal Law and Policy program. Laura has taught law and philosophy courses at several institutions, including Vermont Law and Graduate School and George Mason University. She holds a JD and a Master of Environmental Law and Policy from Vermont Law School, and both a master's and a BA in philosophy from George Mason University, where she was recognized as a distinguished alumnus for her contributions to philosophy and animal law. Our third speaker is Dr. Crystal Heath. Crystal is a Los Angeles-based shelter veterinarian and the executive director of Our Honor, a nonprofit that supports veterinary students, veterinarians, and animal professionals in speaking their conscience to create a more ethical systems that create the best interests of all species. She's also on the board of LEAP, Leaders for Ethics, Animals, and the Planet, known as the humane alternative to 4-H and FFA, which aims to transform today's youth into the humane leaders of tomorrow who advocate for and work towards an equitable future for all living beings on the planet. Dr. Heath is also on the founding committee of Veterinarians Against Ventilation Shutdown. Dr. Heath was named one of Vox's 2023 Future Perfect 50, which honors the scientists, thinkers, scholars, writers, and activists working on solutions to today's and tomorrow's biggest problems. So I'm going to turn it over to our first speaker, Dr. Greg Berns.
Thanks, Jamie. So let me get my... Does that look good? Yep. Okay, well, thanks again, Jamie. And so I get to kick this off talking about cow puppies, as I call them, or probably more precisely, I'm going to talk about cows as companions. And just by way of how I got to this place, so as Jamie said, um, really for a decade or so, starting in 2011, I had been running a project where I trained dogs to go in MRI scanners. And this was something that started initially on a whim. Before that, I'd been using MRI to study how humans make decisions and really just possibly as an excuse to bring my dog to work, thought, well, wouldn't it be fun to train my dog to sit still in an MRI so I could see what she was thinking? And what turned out to be kind of this crazy side project turned into really something quite remarkable, where it turned into a big community project and then expanded out to collaborations with canine companions, which you see the picture of some of their dogs here, trying to understand how dogs think, how they see the world. Can we use this technology to predict which dogs might be better suited as service dogs as well as other roles? And um, uh, as I said, it was really kind of quite a remarkable project. And in the end, we had trained over 100 dogs to do this. And when I say train, they were literally trained to lie down in an MRI scanner without any restraints or any sedation and just lay there while we presented various things to them and monitored what was happening in the brain and try to decode it. Uh, COVID pretty much put an end to that. Like many things, the university shut down for a period of time. We tried to carry on, initially training dogs through Zoom. Um, doesn't work that well. Even when things started getting back to normal, everyone was wearing masks, and it became very difficult to understand how dogs were processing the world when all the humans were wearing masks. Um, so I took the opportunity then, since we were all on Zoom and doing things like this, I figured, well, I can do that from anywhere. And as they say, I bought the farm. So I moved to the country about 50 miles south of Atlanta, um, and promptly found myself in the midst of trying to understand agriculture and manage a property with many acres of pasture, and fell into essentially acquiring a bull and two cows, which promptly gave birth to these two calves you see here. And that started my adventure into understanding cows. And the the short version of this is I fell in love with them and have become fascinated by how they think and how social they are, and have now switched from dogs to cows. And as I say, cows are the new puppies. Okay, so before I get into some of the science behind how cows think and how they feel, a little bit of terminology. I use the word cow very generically, like probably most people do, to refer to males and females. That's not correct. The cattle is the proper generic term for all members of the genus. We subdivide both males and females into kind of two versions. With the females, a cow is an adult female that has had a calf. And if it's a female that is young or has not had a calf, we call them heifers. And on the male side, if it's an intact male, it's a bull. And if they've been castrated, it's a steer. I call them all cows, and I will probably refer to them all as cows in this talk, just because that's the more common term. Okay, well, where did cows come from? They are descended from the ancient auroch, and this is a picture from the Lascaux caves in France, which was probably done about 19,000 years ago. So these were the wild progenitors that were eventually domesticated, and they clearly figured very large in our ancestors' minds because there are many paintings of them in the caves. They were much bigger than the modern domesticated cows. And the aurochs actually lived on for quite some time. I believe the last recorded one died in roughly the 1300s in Poland. So it's not the case that they went extinct thousands of years ago. They disappeared a few hundred years ago. But this is where they come from. We just have smaller versions of them, some with horns, some without. And when we talk about cows, I think this is kind of this bucolic picture. Most people kind of have this image in their mind about how cows live on a farm, and indeed, that's probably what I had in mind. And I'm of an age where I kind of think about the show Green Acres, and this is honestly what I've endeavored to create here. But this is not the most common situation. Uh, this is how most cattle live in this country. There are approximately 90 million cattle at any given time. 90% of them are beef cattle, which you see here. And of that population, about a third will be slaughtered each year for meat. So roughly 30 million cattle are kind of turning over each year, if you will. So 30 million going to the slaughterhouse, and then another 30 million or so that are being born each year. And so that's how the population is maintained. Although the population has decreased substantially from the 70s or so or 90s when it reached its peak, probably about 100 million or so as demand for beef has declined. So, kind of with all that in the background, I want to address what we know about how cows actually think. So, when you talk about how cows, or any animal for that matter, thinks, especially mammals, we recognize that they are visual creatures, and cows are very much visual, like we are. And that's really their dominant sense in how they interact with the world. And so you can see here, this is my cow Ethel on the left. That's just a close up of her eye. The thing I'd like to point out about it is that you can see the pupil, and the pupil is actually not a sphere like primates have. It's actually a horizontal slit, which is characteristic of most ungulate species. The reasons for that are debated, but probably a lot of it has to do with when these animals are grazing. Um, their head is tilted in such a way that shaped pupil lets in light where they need it. So largely, it may be paralleling the horizon. So when they're grazing, they can kind of scan the horizon, or keep both eyes on the horizon, if you will, scanning for predators. Um, the other aspect about how they see the world is that their eyes are positioned much more to the side of their head, which results in kind of this expansive view both in front and behind them. So, whereas humans have kind of this large blind spot behind us, if we take both our left and right eyes, we can see probably about 200 or so degrees. We can see kind of past, straight out from our head, a little bit behind us. Cows can actually see almost all the way to their rear, at the expense of the fact that the area where the left and right eye overlap and can see the same thing, the so-called binocular area, is much smaller. And this is fine because they don't have hands like we do, where they don't have to kind of have fine depth perception for the most part. This has kind of interesting consequences for what we call personal space. So all animals have a personal space, which we divide into two zones, and this is standard for primates, and here it's being applied to cows. And all ranchers and cattle people know this, and Temple Grandin has written extensively about this. So the extra personal space is kind of potentially everything that the cow can see or sense or smell in some way. So anything that enters that extra personal space is considered either a threat or something good. But for an animal like a cow, which is fundamentally evolved from species that were predated upon, the cows are not hunters. Uh, Most things entering that extra personal space are initially perceived as potential threats, and until they get close enough where the cow can determine exactly what it is. And if it's not a threat, then they will let it into their peripersonal space, which is the area around them that they can act upon immediately. So in a primate, that would be areas that you can reach with your hands. For a cow, it's areas that they can kick or butt with their head or move in some way. So to enter the peripersonal space, you have to be their friend, or at least be non-threatening, because they will not let you in otherwise. So as Jamie said, I am a neuroscientist, and so I am interested in brains. And these are MRI scans of several different species. So the human is on the right, and this is approximately to scale. It's pretty close to scale. The human brain, of course, is the largest here. A dolphin is similar in size. Cow is not quite as big, and then a dog is about the size of a plum. Um, Neuroscientists and psychologists kind of like to scale brains based on a ratio of sorts to body weight, and that's called the encephalization quotient. Um, where an encephalization quotient, or an EQ of 1, means that an animal has an average size brain for their body weight taken across all mammals. So if an animal has a large EQ, essentially they have a large brain for their body size. Humans have the largest EQ of 7. Dolphins are close behind at 5. Dogs are a little above average at 1.2, and cows come in, I'm afraid, at 0.6. However, you can look at these pictures and see something interesting about it, and that is how folded they are, how wrinkly they are. The dog is, as we say, kind of a smooth brain, which means that there's not as much neural tissue packed in there per volume, whereas humans and dolphins are very, what we call gyrified, which means that they're packing in a lot more neurons. And cows, surprisingly, look kind of similar to humans, which means that even though their overall brain size might not be as big as you'd expect for their bodies, they seem to be cramming a lot of tissue in there and using the space efficiently. And that may, we don't know, imply that they might be smarter than most people think. How smart are they? Well, let's start by talking about self-awareness. So this is part of my little herd on the farm. One thing that figures very prominently in the literature is the so-called mirror test, which is you put a mirror up and you see what the animals do. Now, if anyone's done this with their cat or dog, most cats or dogs either ignore their reflections entirely, or in the case of dogs, they may bark at their reflections, clearly not understanding what they're looking at. This had never been done with cows. You see here a picture of my guys. Just they're rapt with attention at what they're looking at. You can't tell from this still picture what they're doing, but here's a video from a trail cam that I put next to it. This is Lucy. She's the boss cow of the herd. And what I want you to notice is she's actually not looking directly at herself. She's at an angle, and she's actually using the mirror to look at the herd mates. I'll play that again. You can kind of see what's going on. She looks behind it, and now she's at an angle, and now she's looking at the reflections of the other cows. This is quite remarkable. Doesn't mean that she's self-aware, but she has an understanding that the reflection is not something behind the mirror, which many animals, that's what they do. They'll look behind the mirror to see the animal, and she's not doing that. So she has figured this out, which is really quite a high level behavior when it comes to mirrors. The other thing I want to highlight is how cows socialize and how emotional they are. Most people don't realize this because most people don't interact with cows. And I would say probably most people's impressions of cows is from the side of the road. You're driving down the interstate and you see a herd out there, and because they're not moving terribly much, they appear to be these inert objects in the landscape. They are very active. They don't necessarily move at our pace, but one of the things that's very interesting is their social behaviors. They're very social creatures. And you see here how they demonstrate affection for each other. So on the left, the black cow is Lucy. She's the boss cow. And there she's giving the white cow, whose name is BB, a neck licking. And that's how they groom each other. Some of it's grooming, but mostly it's just social bonding. And the pose that BB is assuming mimics the pose that a calf assumes when they're nursing from their mama's udder from underneath. And that's what we call a neotenous behavior. It's the retention of juvenile traits into adulthood. And you can see here on the right that that's BB. He reciprocates with me, so my herd accepts me into their midst, and they show affection to me the same way they do each other. They lick each other. They lick me too. Do cows play? Absolutely. So you've probably heard of play signals in dogs, things like play bows. So here you see some of these are still pictures. On the left, that calf, that's Cricket. She's doing a little bunny hop. They hop and they twist their heads when they want to play and they go running around. And then on the right, you see a cow version of play bow. You can really imagine that looks very much like what dogs do, even to the point where you see the tail up in the air, which is actually waving back and forth. Just they wag their tails. And here, just to show you that they really can kick up their heels and have fun. This is the herd having fun with a pile of sand. Don't usually see this from the side of the road. When they get like that, I usually back off. Um, and the other thing about them, which we have found, is that they're really such gentle creatures that they invite us to join them. And this is yeah, remember that pastoral picture I showed you? This is what I've been aiming for. And these are my neighbors here in the country. And when people saw me kind of sitting down with the cows and cavorting with them, they thought it was odd until I invited them to join us and see how they felt. And so it's very relaxing, it's very grounding, and the cows are very accommodating and seem to enjoy it too. So that's all I have to say. I invite you to pick up a copy of Cowpup if you want to read all about the journey in detail. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Greg. I really love the Plain Cows videos. So much fun. And the book I can attest to is wonderful. I've already read it. So now I'm going to turn it over to Laura Fox. That looks great, Laura. I can see everything perfectly.
Wonderful. Okay, good. Thanks so much. And oh, that was so refreshing to see cows actually having joy. And unfortunately, in my presentations, I'm maybe gonna have the opposite depictions. But I'll try to warn you when those occur. Um, so I think I'm going to try to talk about sort of how us lawyers might be able to use, the scientific information, either, from studies like Dr. Berns on cow neurology or other areas of science to, further litigation and policy making in this space. One disclaimer is nothing in this presentation constitutes legal advice, and the views expressed are my own and not necessarily that of my affiliated organizations. Though, the first claim I'll make, I don't think is very controversial, and that is that lawyers need scientists. There's a reason most of us went to law school, and part of that might have been that we wanted to avoid math and science studies. So scientists can help lawyers understand complex issues, whether it be about animal behavior and emotions or about the environmental pollution created from those industries that exploit animals. And then in turn, right, lawyers might be able to build cases based on the science to advance animal issues. Or use the science to influence policy that is aimed at protecting animals. There are countless ways lawyers and scientists can collaborate. I'll spend some time focusing on ways lawyers have worked with scientists to advance farm animal protections. So many of you might be, familiar with the status of farmed animals in the U.S. For those that are not, you might be surprised to hear that in the U.S., more than 10 billion land animals are killed every year. That's 1 million birds, pigs, cows, I guess I should say cattle, Dr. Berns, and other animals per hour. And these numbers only include the animals that are actually slaughtered. You could add maybe 6 to 10% of those animals that die during production or during transport. And of course, those numbers don't include aquatic animals. So you could add, billions more. And the vast majority of the land animals raised in the U.S. for food are raised in what are called concentrated animal feeding operations, or CAFOs. Here's a dairy CAFO in Idaho, I believe. And so with all the animals raised in the US, and with the large industries at play here, you would potentially imagine that there's some federal laws that might regulate how animals are raised or treated on these facilities. But really, the law at the federal level is silent as to how animals are treated at these facilities. There are, some US laws that regulate the treatment of certain animals during slaughter and transport. So the Humane Methods of Slaughter Act, for instance, says that covered animals, so that would include cattle, sheep, pigs, but I guess notably not poultry. This law says that those animals must be rendered insensible to pain before being shackled or hoisted or cut during slaughter. So the law creates a standard that, if not met, can show a violation of that law. The standard there being, animals rendered insensible to pain before going through the slaughter line. And we can rely on scientists to help demonstrate violations of the law, to provide evidence of animals in distress or feeling pain, especially when it might not be so apparent or evident. Unfortunately, though, for these laws, we have to rely on our government, namely the United States Department of Agriculture, to enforce the laws. So we can petition with this evidence that's supported by scientific studies or analysis, but ultimately it's the U.S. Department of Agriculture that is charged with enforcement. Historically, enforcement of these laws is low, and I would expect enforcement to continue to decline as reductions in force occur, especially with slaughterhouse inspectors. And even if we did have full enforcement, I would argue that the penalties associated with these laws aren't really strong deterrents for choosing to not violate them. So legal advocates have to turn to other legal tools to help advance animal interests in the law. Here are just several areas of law that provide potential avenues to advance animal interests. So we'll take a quick look at a few case studies that pulled from some of these areas of law. The first case example uses environmental and administrative law, and this case was brought by some animal advocacy organizations challenging the United States Department of Agriculture's response plan to highly pathogenic avian influenza. And we'll hear next from Dr. Heath about how this is a continuing crisis. Bird flu is spreading currently, and it's something that we need to, help prevent the spread and the mutation of the virus. for hopefully preventing another pandemic. And so it's really crucial that we have response plans that are robust, and having a faulty response plan is incredibly dangerous. So this lawsuit raised issues with USDA's failure to consider less environmentally harmful alternatives as required under the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA. So such alternatives include putting conditions on indemnification payments, or reimbursements paid to producers for their losses of animals or products that had to be killed or destroyed in response to an outbreak. Such conditions on indemnity or reimbursement might include, having producers adopt less risky practices when they go to restock animals, and such practices might be lower stocking densities, which would provide animals with more space. So the lawsuit relied heavily on scientific studies like, these shown, that demonstrated a link between animal welfare and public health. So the studies showed that providing animals with more space and enriching their environments help to mitigate conditions that otherwise tend to spawn novel viruses and allow for their mutation and enhance virulence. So, conditions at concentrated animal feeding operations and transport, where animals are concentrated in large numbers and in tight environments, create a breeding ground for disease. In another lawsuit, a Fourth Circuit judge noted how it's well established in the scientific literature that close confinement of animals leads to the spread of disease. So packing several, sometimes hundreds of thousands of animals into crowded spaces limits their movement, provides them with no meaningful opportunity to separate. And these conditions and practices make factory farming a matchbox for viruses. So neighbors of large hog CAFOs in North Carolina in this Fourth Circuit lawsuit brought a challenge against Murphy Brown, a subsidiary of Smithfield Foods, which is one of the largest pork producers in the world. And they sued the company for claiming that the hog CAFOs nearby created a nuisance, right? They interfered with the use and enjoyment of their property. Living close to these facilities where thousands of pigs are housed, where they produce tons, hundreds of tons of thousands of gallons of waste that's stored in opened air lagoons and then sprayed into the air over fields, as you could imagine, resulted in unbearable odors and fly infestations and other harms, where it prevented these neighbors, the plaintiffs, from enjoying their yards, right? Going outside for extended periods of time. And so lawyers relied on expert scientists who testified that the odors were, likely coming from the hog facilities and not somewhere else. So the defendant in the case, pointed to some turkey farms down the road and suggested that, that's the ultimate cause of your injuries. And the scientist in the case used a biomarker called pig tobacco to demonstrate that particulates from the pig fecal matter were present on plaintiff's property, which supported their claims, right? That it was ultimately Murphy Brown and those hog facilities that were creating this harm. In the context of consumer protection cases, scientists can be helpful in a number of ways. So scientists might be used to help test whether a product meets a market claim. So for instance, in a lawsuit brought against Pilgrim's Pride, one of the largest poultry producers in the world, a subsidiary of JBS, the largest meat producer, these groups claimed that Pilgrim's Pride's claim that its chickens used to create its products were fed all natural ingredients was misleading. And a study conducted on Pilgrim's Pride chickens, scientists were able to uncover that they were given antibiotics like bactriacin and naracin in their feed. So drugs that contradicted the all-natural claims that this company was making. So for, marketing claims like humanely raised, animal behavior scientists, for instance, right, could help debunk those claims based on their research about, what humane practices are, and then reviewing conditions of the animals raised to tell whether or not those claims comport with the actual practices. And then other kinds of scientists are heavily used in these cases, such as social or behavioral scientists, even data scientists, those that can design defensible consumer surveys to help support what a reasonable consumer thinks of certain claims. So often consumer studies are submitted to show that consumers find particular claims misleading. So for instance, in this lawsuit, there was consumer research that suggested that most consumers believed from the term, all natural ingredients, that those ingredients would be free from, antibiotics or, toxins or other artificial chemicals. Another obvious way science and law interacts is in the context of animal cruelty cases. While I mentioned there are no laws at the federal level that protect animals on the farm, state laws may be applicable. Every state has an anti-cruelty law, and while many of those, exempt farmed animals or agricultural practices from their protections, some certainly don't have that exemption, and of those that do, the exemption isn't necessarily categorical. So for instance, the law might exempt, traditional or customary or accepted husbandry practices, but not farmed animals as a whole. And so lawyers can challenge the application of the exemptions by demonstrating that certain practices are not common or accepted, right? Scientific studies revealing the cruelty of actions like tail docking or beaking without anesthesia, those studies would be instrumental in helping craft the legal arguments and convincing a court or a jury, right, that these kinds of practices are cruel and not accepted. So with the help of scientists, advocates have been able to make a lot of progress in banning the cruelest forms of confinement practices. So things like battery cages for egg-laying hens, gestation crates for mother pigs, and veal crates for young calves. I believe 15 states have banned at least one of these practices, if not all three. And many more states are debating similar laws. But of course, these laws are often challenged, right? Industries that benefit from utilizing these practices might file, a constitutional challenge claiming that these violate any number of factors. And in fact, I believe another challenge to California's Proposition 12, which is California's ban on these practices, is before the Supreme Court, and will be going to a conference in just a few weeks. And of course, just a few years ago, the Supreme Court had taken up a challenge to California's Proposition 12. And in that lawsuit, many scientists weighed in. And I'll point out that, it was on both sides of the V. So here's just a screenshot of an amicus brief submitted by a group of veterinarians on behalf of the National Pork Producers Council, who was challenging this law. And in their brief, they were claiming, the use of gestation crates, or as they phrased it, individual stalls, were important for sow welfare. And somehow the veterinarians also were opining that the use of the stalls had no negative effect on human health. Now, of course, there were veterinarians on the other side to submit their research showing the opposite. And obviously, California voters were aligned with those arguments and voted to pass this initiative. But it's always helpful to have scientists weigh in support of the laws. And help, right, to sort of oppose those that are claiming the opposite. So having scientific studies to back up the claims that support the state's sort of interest in these laws is essential. Of course, while laws like Proposition 12 made progress on getting animals out of the most sort of cruel forms of confinement, these conditions are far from what they would experience in their natural environment. And so scientists can help us improve the laws by showing us what higher welfare practices promote animal in their natural behaviors. And we might be able to then take those studies to influence the drafting of the next ballot initiatives or laws, or might be able to, use the studies to educate lawmakers on those issues. Lawmakers can't be experts in everything, and so they rely heavily on experts to advise them. And scientists can be very helpful in supporting legislative efforts and also opposing harmful bills. So, just yesterday, I have the Oversight Committee pictured there because they had a hearing on taxpayer-funded animal cruelty yesterday, where a professor of public health from Johns Hopkins testified. So, from advising legislative drafters to testifying at committee hearings, right? The voices of scientists are crucial in establishing animal protection legislation. Similarly, with supporting good administrative rules and regulations, we need scientists' voice heard. So in the process of developing rules and regulations, we want to submit to the administrative record science and studies and reports and research that support the conclusions that we're hoping the agency to reach. And this also allows us a stronger position to challenge laws or regulations, right? When we feel like they don't adhere to the evidence that's before the agency. So it's really important to get scientists involved early on in all of these stages to set you up for a situation where the lawyers can come in and either try and support good rules, regulations, and laws, or try and challenge bad ones that are harmful for animals. Another area where we're increasingly needing help from scientists is in advancing climate change litigation in this space. Science tells us that animal agriculture contributes significant to greenhouse gas emissions, and it's largely responsible for the largest anthropogenic sources of super pollutants like methane and nitrous oxide. And studies being developed, especially in the context of attribution science, which can sort of track the causal links from human activities to global climate change, to its effects on natural and human systems, even source attribution studies that can help identify the relative contributions from different sectors or activities and climate change impacts will allow lawyers to help build cases against those actors and hopefully hold them accountable. Scientists are also essential in finding climate solutions and helping to develop laws and regulations that aim to mitigate animal agriculture's impacts on climate change. So scientific research shows that false solutions like the use of anaerobic digesters to convert methane to biofuel, the use of feed additives that limit the methane from things like enteric fermentation, the natural processes that ruminants go through in digestion that creates methane, that these technologies alone aren't enough to reduce animal agriculture's impacts to meet our greenhouse gas reduction goals, right? Those found like in the Paris Agreement, or various states have their own greenhouse gas emission goals. And so, we need scientists and lawyers to work together on these issues to help tackle the complex problems. So I'll leave it there. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Laura. I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to Dr. Crystal Heath next. Crystal, if you'd please share your screen.
Oops. Hold on.
That looks
All right,
great.
can
Yeah.
you all see that? Okay, cool. So yeah, my name is Dr. Crystal Heath, and we are right now experiencing a really bad flu season. Hospitals are overflowing with influenza, COVID, RSV cases, and schools are closing due to the surge of illness. And right now, the CDC is ordering accelerated subtyping to determine how many of these cases are H5N1. Why do we care? Well, it's because, oops, hold on. The dairy industry and the poultry industry is experiencing an unprecedented outbreak of H5N1 avian influenza, and this has led to infections in humans. And as of today, there are 959 dairy herds across the US that have tested positive for H5N1. And since the outbreak began, the headlines tell us, don't worry, the milk supply is safe and the risk to the public is low. And we are told repeatedly that pasteurized milk is safe. Why is this constant reassurance? The mainstream media rarely leaves any room for nuance, and no one wants to be accused of being an alarmist, which feeds right into corporate goals to quell public fear and maintain consumer confidence. Studies like this that might weaken consumer confidence and harm corporate profits don't make the news. While we don't have any confirmation that anyone has gotten sick from drinking pasteurized milk, this research found that there may be the possibility of viral resistance to thermal pasteurization. And these researchers say a stronger pasteurization regimen in terms of temperature and duration of thermal treatment is recommended to inactivate such potentially infectious virons in food products. And there's been a lot of news about raw milk. Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who is the choice to head the Department of Health and Human Services, told an audience in June of last year that he only drinks raw milk. Raw milk has led to the death of cats. In fact, the first sign that a dairy is infected is when cats die after drinking the unpasteurized milk. The mortality rate in cats is reported to be as high as 89.6%. And late last year, 5 cats even died after drinking H5N1 infected commercial raw milk from Raw Farm. As a result of finding H5N1 in their milk, Raw Farm's products were recalled and the sales were suspended. But Raw Farm insists that there are no illnesses associated with their products and that this is purely a political issue, which is what you do when your profits are at stake. And I have been hearing anecdotally from veterinarians of cats that cats are getting sick from each other, and humans in that same household are getting sick. And just yesterday, the CDC posted some data indicating that cats may be able to infect each other and their humans. And this table was the deleted table from the report. And they say in one household, an infected cat might have spread the virus to another cat and to a human adolescent, according to a copy of the data table obtained by the New York Times. The cat died 4 days after symptoms began. In a second household, an infected dairy farm worker appears to have been the first to show symptoms, and the cat then became ill 2 days later and died on the 3rd day. And in every news story, we are reassured that the risk to the public is low. But at what point is it not? In the CDC's recent morbidity and mortality weekly report, they found that 7% of dairy workers tested seropositive for H5N1. This means that 7% of these dairy workers had antibodies against H5N1 in their blood. So they may have been exposed to the virus at some point and didn't show symptoms. And when workers don't show symptoms, this makes surveillance via testing especially crucial. But workers are scared to be tested for a variety of reasons related to immigration, as 50% of dairy workers are immigrants, and potential loss of work income. And I was recently interviewed for this article in Salon about a study that was supposed to be released by the CDC regarding serological data of dairy veterinarians. And this information is important to further understand the risk of transmission to dairy vets. Unfortunately, because of the communication freeze, that webinar was not held and that data was not released. So we still don't know the results of that study or how seriously dairy vets should take H5N1. And I was recently at a veterinary conference, and the dairy vet who was talking about H5N1 admitted that he still doesn't wear PPE. So how does influenza jump species? Different species have different sialic acid receptors, which are the cellular entry points for flu viruses. Birds prefer alpha-2,3 linked sialic acid receptors, which are found in their intestines. Humans prefer the alpha-2,6 linked sialic acid receptors, which are found in respiratory tracts. Pigs have both types, making them ideal intermediates. And they can be infected with both avian and human influenza viruses, which lead to a reassortment that produces strains capable of infecting humans. Influenza viruses are made up of these 8 segments of RNA. And when a host like a pig or bird or human is infected with multiple strains of influenza at the same time, the viruses can swap gene segments, creating a new strain of potentially pandemic potential. For example, the 2009 H1N1 swine flu pandemic resulted from a reassortment of avian, swine, and human flu viruses. Dairies are a great environment to transmit influenza to humans. The H5N1 virus is found in high concentrations in the mammary glands of cows, and in the milking parlor, you have aerosolized raw milk that can easily get into the eyes, especially if you rub your eyes after touching milk. And we were told that the infected workers had mild conjunctivitis. And when you hear mild conjunctivitis, you might think of like red eyes from allergies, but this is what they actually look like. And this isn't just mild conjunctivitis. This is more severe subconjunctival hemorrhage. And sadly, a patient in Louisiana died after handling dead poultry on his property. This H5N1 virus was identified as the D11 genotype, which has been detected in wild birds and in poultry, but until recently had not been found in cows. This same genotype was found in a British Columbia teen who was severely ill and hospitalized for several weeks before recovering. This is a radiograph of her chest. Her lungs are completely white when it should be black, filled with air. She was placed on ECMO, which is extracorporeal membrane oxygenation, which is a heart and lung bypass machine. This is very serious. And if human-to-human spread became possible and we were having thousands of people with this severity of disease, we would not have the resources to treat them. Now we just found D11 in dairy cows, and this is a game changer, yet some researchers were once again caught completely off guard by this new development. This New York Times piece reads, "Scientists believe that it initially jumped to cows from birds about a year ago, somewhere in the Texas Panhandle. That transition took scientists by surprise, and this new one even more so." John Korsland, who's a former USDA scientist, says, "I can't overemphasize what a big deal this is. This is truly an S show unfolding into a nightmare scenario. And we have no idea how widespread this version of the virus already is in cattle herds. Every time poultry flock breaks with the virus, we'll need to investigate cattle contacts as well as wild bird and other poultry contacts. Michael Osterholm, who's the director of the University of Minnesota's Center for Infectious Disease Research and Policy, has been very insightful throughout this outbreak. And he says, I am not surprised that we're seeing additional introductions, particularly given the very widespread nature right now of H5N1 in migratory waterfowl throughout North America. From a containment standpoint, it just points out that this is not going to burn itself out. And that quote is a callback to June of 2024, when Eric Diebel of the USDA repeated to scientific experts what USDA Secretary Tom Vilsack had said, that the virus was just going to burn itself out. I was interviewed by Catherine Eban of Vanity Fair for this article that describes the silencing and retaliation veterinarians faced for trying to communicate and do their job. And it seems corporate profits and maintaining consumer confidence in the industry took precedence over public health. I co-authored this article in Time magazine that goes into how government and industry seek to maintain consumer confidence and ignore many of the red flags associated with this model of intensive animal-based protein production. It dives into just how the number and severity of infectious disease outbreaks are getting worse. Yet the industry always seems to be caught off guard and having to resort to cruel or dangerous practices in order to deal with the problem that they created. But a major problem is the government organization charged with regulating the industry, the United States Department of Agriculture, doesn't actually have a directive to ensure a safe and accessible food supply. Instead, it has a mandate to protect corporate interests and expand markets for animal-based protein production. So even scaling down the poultry or dairy industry and redistributing subsidies to support animal-free methods of food production would go against their mandate. And this is a disturbing statement from Scott Gottlieb, a former US Food and Drug Administration commissioner. And he says, there's always this tension between human health people and animal health people. The human health people would swab anything. Animal health people worry more about the economic implications. And should that be our reputation as veterinarians who should be caring advocates for animals? Should we prioritize economics over public health and animal welfare? Throughout this outbreak, the USDA has protected corporate interests. They want to dampen any concern that might lead to decreased consumer confidence. They jumped the gun and reported early on that the cows were not transmitting the virus to other cattle within the same herd. This claim was eventually refuted, and they found that there was cow-to-cow spread in dairy herds and that the virus can even spread from dairy cow facilities to nearby poultry facilities. This is a picture that I took in Wasco, California. The facility on the left mass exterminated more than 1 million egg-laying hens due to HPAI. And the facility across the street on the right is a huge dairy. I noticed that in the media, there were no photos of sick and dead cows. So I traveled to the Central Valley of California to see if I could find any evidence for myself. And I found sick and dead piles of cows on the side of the road. There were no signs anywhere warning people of the public health risks. And I called the California Department of Food and Agriculture to voice my concerns about this, and they seemed not to care. And this is a photo that a colleague shot of workers at that same egg facility cleaning up after the depopulation. This person is not wearing a mask. And this person was wearing a mask incorrectly below the nose. So trigger warning for the next few slides, there are pictures of dead cows, sick cows, and aborted fetuses. And these are the photos that I shared with the media. This is a photo of the dairy across from the big egg facility in Wasco, California. You can see birds everywhere, and this cow was laying down, dribbling urine with a cow in the background with nasal discharge. And the other cows were seen aborting fetuses. I found these bodies on the side of the road in Hanford, and this producer confirmed that they had avian influenza. This is a photo that ended up in Vanity Fair, and this was taken in the beginning of October in Tipton, California. There were flies covering the bodies, and I wondered if flies were perhaps facilitating the spread of H5N1, and wondered whether it would be beneficial to require the bodies to be sprayed with fly repellent. A journalist went out there after I sent the photos and found another body lying here, and also found a dog sniffing around the body. But that detail did not make it into the media story. But the producer did confirm that these cows had avian influenza. This is a facility in Tulare, and in this photo, you see one cow with nasal discharge, and in the background, there are 2 aborted fetuses covered with flies. Here's another shot of a cow with nasal discharge lying down and seeming to have difficulty breathing with the 2 fetuses. This is another dead cow I found in Tulare nearby to that facility. The industry says that they have to leave the bodies out on the side of the road for rendering trucks to pick them up without going into the facility and risking disease spread. But that doesn't explain why they are uncovered and why there are no signs anywhere warning of the risk. And this is a cow in Buttonwillow, California. And I noticed she is passing placenta, either giving birth or aborting. And these were dead cows outside that same facility. So what are the laws about carcass disposal? The California code reads, animal carcasses from animals on pasture or rangeland shall be managed so as to prevent the creation of excessive vectors or other adverse public health well-being conditions. When we have this many animals all getting sick and dying at once, there are no safe ways to dispose of the bodies and prevent disease spread. So we sent a letter to the California Department of Food and Agriculture recommending that they cover the exposed carcasses and apply fly repellent and post biosecurity signage, warning the public of the risks. They didn't respond to our letter, but they later did send this advisory telling producers that dead stock should be collected and stored in a manner that prevents attraction of wildlife, rodents, and other scavengers. And only if pickup is delayed more than 24 hours should they use temporary barriers like straw or a tarp to minimize scavenging. These are the number of species that have been affected by HPAI: red fox, skunk, mink, raccoon, bobcat, possum, coyote, bears, badgers, seals, and sea lions and cats all experience neurologic symptoms. This shows the number of species within each family affected. But despite the fact that the virus has infected so many different species, when it finally hit dairy cows, the American Association of Bovine Practitioners wanted to rename it bovine influenza virus A, saying, "We believe it is important for the public to understand the difference to maintain confidence in the safety and accessibility of beef and dairy products for consumers." As veterinarians, we take an oath to protect public health and animal welfare. We do not take an oath to protect consumer confidence in beef and dairy. Many scientists spoke out about the bovine vet's decision and move to rename the virus. The International Society for Infectious Diseases said, let's stick with calling it influenza A, H5N1, and worry about dealing with real problems, not misleading the general public or even giving anything close to the appearance of doing so. It was just 2 months ago that this report was published showing that just takes a single mutation to cause bovine influenza H5N1 to switch specificity to human receptors. And a few months before that, they found that these recent mammalian strains are better able to become airborne. They found in the British Columbia teenager who was placed on ECMO that the virus had developed the PB2 E627K mutation, which is a mutation linked to faster replication in human cells and greater severity of illness. And this mutation likely came about during the course of her infection. This mutation is no joke, and it makes the virus more likely to spread through airborne transmission. It also is better able to replicate in human cells. But remember, we're still telling people the risk to the public is low. All this when there are alternatives like board cow milk, which is milk made without cows. It's made via precision fermentation, which is the same process we use to make insulin. But why isn't board cow milk seen everywhere on McDonald's Happy Meal menus and in schools? Well, because we don't incentivize that method of protein production. We incentivize cow-based methods of protein production. In fact, according to this study done for the dairy industry, 73% of dairy revenues come from some form of subsidy. And there are state and federal programs now to give money to dairies for capturing their methane and using these dairy digesters, which are basically tarps covering manure lagoons. And some dairies who do this make more money selling these low carbon fuel standard credits than they do by baking milk. And right now there are 24 federal programs used to incentivize these dairy digesters. But what if we incentivized animal-free methods of protein production? According to this 2023 article, we would save $7.3 trillion in health burdens and ecosystem degradation. And this research out of the T.H. Chan School of Public Health found that high-density livestock operations can serve as an opportune environment for spillover from wild animals into livestock or as incubators for pandemic influenza strains. Large pig and poultry farms are where the genetic reassortment needed to source pandemic influenza strains may most likely occur. But these studies don't make headlines. And we need to start to question this mainstream narrative that's being told to us and look past these headlines. The veterinary profession and most of society viewed the world like this figure on the left, the triangle with the man at the top. And really, corporations should be at the top. Women are below him, and other animals are ranked in order of their moral concern to us. But One Health shows us that all living beings are interconnected. If we harm one species, all of us are affected. And our honor is currently working hard to get these facts into the public and the media. You can check out all of our recent press by going to ourhonor.org/press. And if you have any questions, please feel free to reach out. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Crystal. Really fantastic presentations, everyone. I'd like to ask everybody, the panelists, to please turn your camera back on. We're going to begin a Q&A session. And the first question I have is for Greg. We have been led to believe, the general public believes that many animals don't feel pain at all. So how can science help us change this narrative?
Yeah, that's a good question. I mean, and it's something, that I even encounter in the veterinary field too, seeing how procedures done on livestock typically don't, it's unusual to have any kind of analgesia for cattle, certainly. So the role science has in this, I think, is one, educating people in how the pain system works in the first place. And so we understand a lot about that in human brains. And when you start looking at human brains and compare them to other, especially mammalian brains, as I showed that picture, you see that there are more similarities than differences, especially when it comes to how the pain system works. And just kind of very briefly, pain is triggered by what we call nociceptors, usually in the skin and periphery, and those exist in all mammals. We know they do. That's how big pharma develops medicines that treat pain. We have animal models for these things. And then the signals get transmitted to the spinal cord and then interpreted by the brain. And when you look at the nervous systems of all these animals, those parts are all the same. There's not really anything different about it. So just kind of giving facts like that, I think, can help people understand. Now, I will say what's different about most animals than people is most animals are pretty stoic about it. Animals evolve to hide their pain because animals that are in pain, if they show it, are easy targets for predators. And so that is kind of deeply ingrained in their behaviors. It doesn't mean that it doesn't exist, though.
Yeah, thank you for pointing that out. I think that there's a big discrepancy in how different species are treated depending on how much we care about them. And just working to better understand what the science is can really help change public perception. And I wanted to ask Laura, what role does public awareness and education play in the intersection of science and animal law?
Yeah, thanks. I mean, public awareness and education plays a crucial role, by informing the public about the latest, scientific findings related to animal welfare, behaviors, their needs, right? we're able to foster greater understanding and appreciation of the issues, right? Maybe dismantle that hierarchy that Crystal was talking about. And sort of public awareness and education plays a role in empowering citizens to be advocates for stronger science-backed animal welfare laws and policies. Right, a knowledgeable, well-informed public discourse on these issues, can put pressure on lawmakers and hopefully result in more robust, and evidence-based laws and policies. So ultimately, education, leads to more engaged and informed citizens and help to drive more sustainable and meaningful legal reforms for animal protection.
Yeah, thank you for that. And that sort of ties back into something Crystal had mentioned earlier regarding her work with, LEAP, which is a replacement for groups like FFA and could really help educate younger people. I think that's really important. And so now that we're all really terrified too after Crystal's presentation, thanks for that, Crystal. Will the seasonal flu vaccine that we have now help protect us from H5N1?
I think there's one study showing that it may confirm some protection, but the big concern is we don't want somebody, right now it's influenza, the seasonal virus is circulating everywhere. We don't want somebody to be infected with the seasonal flu virus and H5N1 and create in the environment for the virus to reassort. So by getting vaccinated for the seasonal flu, you will help prevent a virus of potentially pandemic potential.
So those who can get the vaccine should do it. Thank you for that. So let's go back to cows and puppies. And so I'd like to ask Greg, why do you think that cows and dogs are treated differently?
Well, the short answer is because people eat cows. And so it's hard to eat an animal with a name. But that doesn't kind of, I think, get at the root of the issue, which is, especially in this country, I think people, most people have no experience with livestock. The situation was completely different 100 or 200 years ago when people lived with the animals that eventually they ate and formed relationships with them and understood that all the animals had personalities and were individuals, and frankly, were probably treated with respect and dignity in a way that doesn't exist now because of the industrialized ag system that essentially commoditizes animal products. And so it's just easier for people to ignore it. But I guarantee you, if you lived with any of these animals, then you would immediately see that they have much more in common with our pets than you want to admit.
Yeah, I think that your videos, especially the sand pile playing, I mean, you can see dogs or any other companion animal like doing the same kind of behaviors and running around with their tails up, play bowing, having a good time. So, if more people were exposed to those images, I think that would be really helpful. So I wanted to ask Laura, how can legal professionals better collaborate with scientists to ensure that the most relevant and recent research is being utilized?
Thanks, Jamie. I mean, I think this is a great start, right? Interdisciplinary panels, right? Like this, where lawyers and scientists get to engage and learn from each other and hear about the most up-to-date data, right? On things like avian influenza or neuroscience, right? And then we can collaborate, and think through, novel ways to approach it. And I think, this is a good start at getting to another area where I think would be great to help ensure that we're able to utilize recent developments and understand, right, what the science is saying. And that's for everybody to learn to communicate, more effectively across, disciplinary boundaries. Lawyers have specific lingo and jargon and evidentiary standards, and scientists might have, different ones, or I know, right, they do. And without knowing those, it leads to miscommunications and misunderstandings. And I think one good example of this is in the civil law context, right? When we're trying to prove a civil wrong, us lawyers in court, right? Our burden of proof is a preponderance of evidence, and so that's more likely than not. So we're talking about 51%. Whereas when scientists, right, are publishing their papers and doing their studies, right, they usually require a much higher confidence level, right, to claim that there's a reasonable degree of certainty of their study. And it's essential to maintain that strict standard for defensibility of their work, right? But because maybe we're approaching sort of the conversation from maybe these different standards of more likely than not versus highly confident, we might be sort of not on the same page, and jurors might not be on the same page either, depending on what background and nomenclature and jargon they're coming to the table with. So I think it's really important to have these conversations and sort of acknowledge where we might be talking maybe across each other or have different foundations for things that we're talking about. And then, another way I think for us to better collaborate is where possible. And I know with resources and timing and stuff, it's not always possible, but if there's ways to create interdisciplinary teams for specific cases or policy projects, that would be amazing. Quick plug for the work that we're doing at Yale in our Law, Environment, and Animals program, where we bring together fellows and students from the law school and the environmental studies school and from all different backgrounds to collaborate to try and solve complex legal issues. And when you have that ability, it really can enhance the accuracy and the impact of the advocacy that you actually bring forward.
Those are some really good points. And, we have a lot of constraints. Things are lost in translation, the legalese via, versus the scientific terminology as well. And then as animal lawyers, we're not like the, dairy industry with all of this money behind us. We're a smaller group of people and our funding is a little bit more limited. And so these collaborations are even more important for us. And so I wanted to ask Crystal, what does the recent development of H5N9 and California ducks mean for humans and animals?
We're really worried that that particular strain could reassort with H5N1. And then that could again create a virus of pandemic potential. And we'll see if that virus is becoming more frequent in more poultry flocks. That's very concerning, just like the new reintroduction of the genome D11 virus in dairy cows. We're just creating a situation where all these influenza viruses going around, and if one flock is infected with both, that would be just devastating and create the perfect environment for a virus of pandemic potential.
Do you think that we're going to be able to get that information when it's happening, given a lot of the recent, rescinding of info and stuff like that that's been going on?
But it's been really challenging. I think a lot of federal vets, we're looking to try to figure out back channel communications. We're all kind of how do we get this information out there without having to rely on the government to distribute this information? And that's why it's so important to talk directly to the media. And I hope that people working within the federal government can talk to us so we can get this information out there. And scientists, don't wait for the CDC to release your results. Tell us and we'll release it directly to the media. That's what we got to do.
That's a great point. Just circumvent those channels and go directly to the source. So Greg, I have another question for you. So your book, Cow Puppy, points out how cows need their personal space, and you kind of demonstrated what those areas of personal space were. So based on what you've learned about cow boundaries, how do you think that CAFOs impact cattle?
Yeah, I mean they're very physical, and what's interesting about them left in a natural environment like I have them is that they maintain strong social bonds with each other. So my herd is a family unit because they are all descended from the same, certainly the same bull, and then the two mamas. So um, there was one study done mm, quite a while back on a herd in Africa where they went out and kind of just followed what happened and recorded which cows stayed next to each other. And what was interesting about that is that the mamas had special relationships with their calves for the duration of their study. They went out for 4 years, and so the mama and their calves were still bonded. I mean, obviously not nursing, but they still had relationships. So I think to me, the biggest effect of the CAFOs is kind of the breaking of these natural familial bonds that these animals have. They are incredibly strong. And anyone, who's been to a dairy farm knows what happens. I mean, the whole way that milk is produced is by taking the calf away so it can't nurse anymore. And I mean, it's painful. And so I think that's probably more even than the personal space issue is kind of the disruption of their natural social tendencies.
Thank you for that. Yeah, I think that those of us who've worked in advocacy and animal law have seen those heart-wrenching videos, and people in the industry know that those animals want to be together. The mamas and the babies, they cry for each other, and it's really heartbreaking. My next question is for Laura. Are there ethical implications of using animal science in litigation or policymaking?
Hmm. So yeah, I think there's a couple approaches to answer this question, and both roads lead to yes. So I'll take the first of like ethical as in moral issues. And then the second would be like ethical as in like in the legal context, we have ethical obligations, right? So, with regard to like moral implications of using animal science to advance litigation or policy initiatives, right? Like some might view that, even if you're using the best standards of care in your research, research on animals might be considered right, exploitative, right? And if applying like a deontological rules-based ethic, you might just have a rule that that's just wrong, right? And so using animals for research purpose and then relying on that to advance anything, right? It has an ethical sort of conundrum in it. But you could also view it under like a utilitarian perspective where, you consider the broader benefits, right? So doing research on animals might and utilizing the results of that could lead to greater benefits for the animals as a whole. And so if you're considering it through that lens, then it might be justifiable. Um, and, even if considering it on a utilitarian basis, there might be an argument to say, invasive research on animals is wrong and you shouldn't rely on that or use that. Different analysis might come to play if you're relying on research that has already been done like long ago in the past, right? And formulating arguments and bases based on that. So yeah, I think reasonable people can disagree on what the ethical, moral limits are to relying on research that utilizes animals, right, in their studies, the consent issues, all that kind of stuff. As far as legal ethics go, I think there's definitely issues to consider, right? So when we're engaging lead lawyers or engaging experts, we need to consider, whether there are conflicts of interest. So we're going to want to check, their past work. We're going to want to check where their funding sources come from. We also want to make sure not to dictate results of research if we're trying to commission a study. So for instance, we often have a hunch of what the results will be, right? We're not going to spend our money blindly. in commissioning a scientist to draft a study. But it's really important to not be too prescriptive, right? Because if we are going to use that to sort of as evidence, it needs to be independent. And so, right, we need to make sure that the credibility stays admissible. And then I kind of jokingly in the beginning of my presentation, joked about lawyers not sort of being confused and frazzled by science and math, but I think we do have an ethical obligation to at least be somewhat conversant in science and math or whatever we're presenting to the court, right? We have a duty of candor, and we need to make sure that what we're presenting, whether it be like a scientific study or whatever, isn't misleading, right? That it's straightforward and that it supports what we're arguing it to support. So I don't know, those are a broad bunch of ethical buckets that come to mind when thinking about this.
Yeah, really important points, and I agree with you on that. So I wanted to ask Crystal a question. How might what's going on with bird flu in the United States impact other countries?
Well, we live in a global economy, and it's already H5N1 is already affecting Japan and the UK. I think there's the first illness of a person in the UK recently too. So it's already spread around the world. I mean, this virus originally started in China and then came over to the United States. So it's making its way around the world. I think there's also some trade implications too. The reason that we aren't vaccinating our poultry flocks for H5N1 right now is because that would limit our export markets. And a lot of other countries have set policy that they will not take in imports from countries that vaccinate for avian influenza. And so if we were to start vaccinating, we would lose those export markets. But it's always been like a numbers game. We lose a small percentage of birds. It's still worth it to maintain those export markets. So we choose not to vaccinate. So I think now there's some rethinking of all of this. I mean, we lost 2/3 of California's egg-laying hens. I think we've lost 50% of the egg layers in Ohio. And right now we're seeing empty grocery store egg shelves. I mean, I hope that this will incentivize animal-free methods of egg production. There's already the ability to make egg protein from potatoes and other things. And I hope that baked goods start replacing eggs from their ingredients and replacing it with animal-free ingredients. I think that's what we need to ensure our nation's food security, and just vaccinating will just, kind of keep things assuaged right now, but in a few years there could be another virus. We're just in an ever escalating arms race against nature as it is. So the only smart move is to move away from these methods of protein production.
Thank you for that. So I think we have time for about one more question, and I want to end on an interesting and happy note. So I wanted to ask Greg, from a scientific perspective, what's the most unexpected thing that you learned about your cow companions while you were writing Cow Puppy?
I think probably the most surprising thing is how affectionate they are. I was not prepared for that because I didn't know anything about cows. And when I say affectionate, I know this may be hard to believe, but I mean, it's no different than my dogs. They will lie down. I mean, the cows lie down frequently to ruminate, and I will sit down next to them and they will roll over and put their head in my lap and just kind of roll over and ask for a belly rub. So that's
Sweetest. That's so cute. So we're almost at time, and I just want to thank you all for taking time to present today. I think this is a really great interdisciplinary panel, and I know you put a lot of work into it. So thank you so much. I also want to thank everybody at GW Law Animal Law, especially Joan Schaffner, Kathy Hessler, and Yingzi Dai for helping run this webinar today. And don't forget, the recording will be available on GW Animal Law's YouTube channel, so you can view it later for anybody who missed it, or if you think this is a great program and you want to share it. So thank you so much, everybody, and have a great rest of your day.